Look closely at this graph. It marks the moment the United States government crossed a massive economic threshold. Publicly held debt now equals 100% of the entire U.S. economy. We haven't seen this level since World War II. When politicians talk about returning America to its economic glory days, they usually point to the 1950s. They picture a booming manufacturing base, a thriving middle class, and incredibly low national debt. But they rarely mention the math that made it possible. If you were a top earner in that era, your highest marginal income tax rate was 91%. Corporate tax rates sat above 50%. And because stock buybacks were effectively illegal, executives couldn't simply extract unlimited wealth to inflate their own shares. They had to leave the money in the real economy, reinvesting it into new factories, research, and wages. This chart tracks the result.
Under those strict tax policies, U.S. publicly held debt dropped from its high point after World War II, plunging steadily downward until it fell below 25% of GDP in the early 1970s. The fiscal stability of the 1950s relied on the exact high tax policies that modern political movements now fight to dismantle. The era many romanticized was defined by the very revenue structure they currently oppose. The shift in the nation's financial health began in 1981 with the election of Ronald Reagan. His administration introduced supply-side economics, a strategy centered on aggressively slashing the top marginal income tax rate from 70% down to 28% over his tenure. The core promise used to sell this was that dramatically reducing taxes would spur so much corporate expansion and hiring that the resulting economic growth would generate enough revenue to pay for the cuts themselves. As you can see on the timeline starting in 1981, the promised wave of new revenue never materialized. Instead, the national debt nearly tripled in nominal terms. The post-1981 debt explosion followed the mathematical reality of the new policy. When you dramatically reduce the government's primary source of revenue, the gap between what is collected and what is spent is filled by borrowing. A second major shift occurred a year later, in 1982, when the Securities and Exchange Commission passed Rule 10b-18. This quietly legalized stock buybacks. Before this rule, executives using company cash to buy their own shares faced market manipulation liability. Once legalized, corporations could legally siphon money out of factory reinvestment and funnel it directly to shareholders and CEOs. Looking at this capital flow, the extraction was massive. By the year 2000, buyback volume hit $200 billion, ballooning the pay ratio between an average CEO and a production worker from 50-1 up to 144-1. The one modern interruption to this climbing debt curve happened in 1993 when Bill Clinton raised the top income tax rate on high earners. Critics predicted total economic collapse. Instead, the United States ran 4 consecutive budget surpluses, paying down $453 billion in debt. It is the only stretch of surpluses recorded between 1970 and today. The deficit spending resumed under George W. Bush, who pushed through another round of tax cuts while launching 2 completely unfunded wars. Then Donald Trump signed the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The corporate rate dropped to 21%, freeing up a massive windfall that corporations immediately poured into record stock buybacks, adding an estimated $1.9 trillion to the projected federal deficit. Over 40 years, the math remains remarkably consistent. The debt line climbs with every major tax cut, and it falls only when federal revenues are raised. The public is now paying the carrying cost for those decisions. Over $1 trillion is spent annually on interest payments for the accumulated debt. That $1 trillion actively drains the real economy. It's capital that can't be spent on fixing infrastructure, expanding healthcare, or funding education, because it has to be paid out to bondholders. The Congressional Budget Office modeled this chart's future. With no new tax cuts, debt hits 120% of GDP by 2036. But if the 2017 cuts are extended, the debt curve accelerates, reaching 214% of the U.S. economy by 2054. America's 100% debt-to-GDP ratio represents a 40-year invoice for tax cuts sold as economic growth. The chart shows the price of 4 decades of supply-side policy, and the bill has finally arrived.